So Hawaii's currently accepted model for groundwater is one I suspect that most have seen. This is an image that's been published and widely distributed. And what it represents is a cross-section through ultimately Oahu, an older island, that postulates that we have a so-called Guyben-Hertzberg freshwater lens that recharge infiltrates into this lens and then migrates to the shoreline. Within the interior of the island, we have geologic structures, dikes, and these dikes are derived from magma that's injected underground under very high pressure. They're very dense and have very low permeability. Now, the interesting thing to me is that this model is actually based on work that was done and was initiated here in Hawaii in the 1930s. And it's work of Stearns and McDonald. And this was kind of their model of groundwater storage and movement within the island, where we have rainfall into the flank lavas, and these flank lavas are very permeable. That rainfall recharge infiltrates down to this water table, and you can see this water table is depicted here as very flat, and that water then migrates fairly rapidly out to discharge at the ocean. And they did recognize that we did have these dike systems that held water, and this was the only place that they postulated there would be high elevation water inside the islands, and that water gradually leaks out into the basal, what we call the basal freshwater system, and migrates to the shoreline. Now, in some respects, that Stearns model is correct. At the core of Mauna Kea, we believe that there is a dike complex, and that's based on the work from Wolf and a number of other researchers with the U.S. Geological Survey. They depict a cross-section through the summit of Mauna Kea like this, where buried under Mauna Kea's peak is a shield very much like Mauna Loa. We know that Hawaii's volcanoes go through a fairly rigid sequence of phases of activity to build this shield, so-called shield of very permeable lavas. But then Mauna Kea has advanced to a next stage, or through a next stage of life, where the lavas have become more viscous, and ultimately to a final stage, these so-called Laupahoehoe volcanics. We superimpose Stearns's model over that, and within this caldera, and that's what I need to explain, is that caldera is ultimately the source of all of the magma that comes to the surface and is erupted to form Hawaii's volcanoes. And we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of intrusions of magma within the caldera complex. And so the entire summit region of Mauna Kea is underlain by this dike complex that will allow infiltration in, but holds it in there for an extended period of time before it could potentially leak out and move towards the shoreline. We can get a sense of the size of that area of dike complex. This is a map published in a paper by Flinders and a bunch of others that in effect made density measurements of within all of the islands, and those density measurements indicate where dike accumulations are. The dark colors here are the greatest density zones, and of course they stand above that magmatic conduit coming to the surface from the mantle, but it also extends out to a pretty substantial distance away from the summit down to, this is about a 6,000 foot elevation on Mauna Kea. So we can see that there is evidence of intrusive material of these dike systems extending as far out away from the summit, below and within the volcano as the 6,000 foot elevation. And as I say, that dike complex will have a tendency then to intercept any of the infiltrating groundwater and trap it within that system and tremendously slow its migration towards the shoreline. But actually beginning in 1993, we undertook a project called the Hawaii Scientific Drilling Project. And that presented us with the first definitive data that we really don't understand groundwater flow within the flanks of Hawaii's volcanoes. The hole was unique. It was drilled continuously it was cored continuously from the surface. So we were able to recover complete record of the geology from the surface down to 11,541 feet. And so this is the most complete record that we have of volcanic activity in the state, if not in the world. It is one of the deepest holes that's ever been drilled into an ocean island volcano. And the purpose really was to document the life history. This was a basic research project and intended to give us information on the evolution of a so-called Hawaiian hotspot type of volcano, or what is termed today a mantle plume volcano, which is unique from a lot of the volcanism that happens in the world. Groundwater results actually were expected to be quite boring, because at that time the only model we had was the Stearns model that said, okay, we're going to drill through a basal freshwater lens into saltwater saturated rock, and that's all we're going to see for the rest of the borehole. And initially that's what we found. We drilled through what we call typical subaerial lavas, very porous. This is one of the characteristics of Hawaiian lavas. They have lots and lots of fractures. We have these clinker zones that allow water to flow very freely within the lava flows. But as we moved deeper, we started encountering other types of rock. Okay, this is an ash bed, one of several that we went through, that started appearing as we got down to the surface of Mauna Kea. Now, this is something I need to explain a little bit more. We actually started drilling in lava flows derived from Mauna Loa. All of Hilo is built on Mauna Loa lavas, South Hilo, but this is where Mauna Loa is encroaching onto the old flank, the former flank of Mauna Kea. And so Mauna Kea has been partially buried by these Mauna Loa flows. And we encountered the transition from Mauna Loa to Mauna Kea at about 931 feet. And throughout this zone, we were recovering these ash and clay-rich layers that have a much, much lower permeability than the conventional Hawaiian basalts. And below that transition, we encountered a second freshwater layer. And this was at a depth of about 1,100 feet. Now no one had anticipated this. That freshwater layer was about 400 feet thick. It wasn't just a puddle of water that happened to get trapped. It is literally a river of water that is moving below these low permeability zones. And when we actually drilled into it, we found it had significant artesian pressure, and the well was producing about 2,100 gallons a minute, or about 3 million gallons a day, until we sealed that off. So we've put together a conceptual model or a cartoon of that structure that we encountered. And we've actually encountered this deep freshwater layer in two separate holes. We drilled a pilot hole in '93 and the deep hole in '99. But we went through this layer of fresh water from Mauna Loa, and that was the Mauna Loa basal lens, into salt water. And at this transition from Mauna Loa to Mauna Kea, in both cases we encountered these very impermeable layers, and below that then this river of fresh water. And just by sort of scientific happenstance and good luck, it turned out that back in the 70s there were deep submersible surveys performed off the flank of the Big Island over in the Hilo area. And those deep submersibles actually encountered deep freshwater springs at 1,000 feet below sea level. So we know that this is an active system. It's not a fossil system, that this water is being recharged within the mountain and is slowly migrating out and discharging into the ocean well below any visible water table that we interact with here at the surface. So as the depth of the hole increased, we continued drilling, and we started seeing some additional confining formations. And I'll explain a little bit what we're seeing here. This is a conventional subaerial rock. This is material generated by the processes that Kilauea was experiencing over the last 30 years, where lava flows were going into the ocean. That interaction of seawater with the lava was fragmenting the material, and then that material was cascading down the flank of the volcano. In this case, this happened probably 750,000 years ago, where lava flows from Mauna Kea were going into the ocean, cascading down the flank. As it turns out, as we proceed deeper, that material is experiencing a higher lithostatic load and submarine weathering that deposits minerals within the fractures and the pore space inside of that material. And it turns out it makes them very impermeable. So those compacted, the term for that type of material is hyaloclastite. That compacted hyaloclastite has been cemented back together, and so it forms a very effective barrier to water flow. And then as we continue deeper, we encountered this material, which are termed pillow lavas. And pillow lavas are formed when the vent is actually below sea level. And actually coherent lava flows develop. The flows will move down slope. When they cool very rapidly, and so they're shot through with fractures. And it turned out some of the fractures there were open, and they had water present under very high hydrostatic pressure. I like to show this photo. This is at the rig floor as the guys are actually trying to put an additional piece of pipe on the drill string to continue drilling deeper. And they got a bath every time they did that. At one point, we put a pressure gauge on the wellhead, and we were seeing a pressure of about 150 pounds per square inch. So there's substantial hydrostatic pressure down there. But the big surprise was that that water was fresh. And that was completely off anybody's chart. We were not expecting ever to see fresh water at those kinds of depths, and we know that that extends to a depth of about 10,000 feet below sea level. At one point, we had a continuous casing in the hole. We allowed the well to flow, and the water that was produced was fresh. And so our cartoon for this, then, is that we have the subaerial lavas, and it's also true these subaerial lavas have subsided somewhat. Over time, as the island builds up, it also subsides. But below the subaerial lavas were these unconsolidated hyaloclastites, a very mushy material, very porous, a lot of water flow, all salt water, until we got down into these sort of tongues of pillow lavas, and we ran through multiple layers of these pillow lavas. And those pillow lavas were saturated with fresh water. And it's often mistaken that well, let me say too, this is what the model we started with. This is the model that we ended with. But it's often thought, well, is this a freshwater source? And that's really not the important point of finding this fresh water there. We've got lots of sources of good quality fresh water at the surface we don't have to drill 10,000 feet to get into. But the fact that we're seeing fresh water at that depth told us that, in fact, Stearns' model was wrong, that the basal water table inside of Mauna Kea is not flat, but that we have accumulations of fresh water within Mauna Kea to much higher elevations than we had anticipated. So, subsequent to that, I had a project, have a project with the with UserPack to do a hydrologic study within the saddle. And we've drilled two boreholes, small diameter research boreholes in the saddle. One located here, it's referred to as PTA2, and the second one over here in the Keamuku area. And just to clarify something that was said earlier, these are not on ceded lands. The Army owns the land under both of those wells. The PTA hole provided us some additional surprises. We encountered a perched aquifer at about 5,600 feet above sea level, a depth of only about 700 feet down below the surface. Now, when we started the project, I know every hydrologist in the state was expecting I have to drill to 5,000 feet to see any water. Now, perched aquifer is one of these impermeable layers has accumulated within this area, and whatever rainfall is infiltrating into the ground gets trapped above that sealed layer. It's a bit like Lake Waiau in that respect. Lake Waiau is supported by an impermeable layer of clay and ash. So we found basically that there are these impermeable layers buried within the flank of Mauna Kea. We continued drilling. We got down to a depth of about 1,800 feet. We drilled actually through that perching layer, continued drilling down to 1,800 feet, where we encountered a second freshwater interval, and that extended down to the total depth that we drilled, which was about 5,800 feet down. And that turned out to be a regional aquifer. We were in continuous saturation from 1,800 feet to 5,800 feet down. That's the regional aquifer, and based on the geophysical data we have, it extends over much of that saddle region. The Keamuku hole, we actually found somewhat different characteristics to that. We did not get into the regional aquifer. It turns out we were a little bit to the west of the end of that regional aquifer. But what we did find was a whole series of these confined aquifers, these aquifers that have a perching layer and a capping layer. And as we drilled into them, we would actually see water rise in our borehole from the bit by elevations of 600 feet to as much as 3,500 feet in the borehole. So these systems are under quite high hydrostatic head. And to get an idea of what some of these things look like, this is one of the confining layers. It starts here, and you can see this is a very heavily compressed ash. This is an explosion deposit, and it extends over to about here. And that actually was the confining layer holding back that 1,500 psi hydrostatic head. So what we're seeing, in fact, is not a continuous, well-mixed groundwater system, but we're seeing essentially isolated layers of water, and they allow that water to become segregated vertically. And what we found in some other work that I've done on the island is that the highest elevation recharge ends up in the deeper of these confined aquifers. We've looked at the chemistry. We found this in the Keho aquifer, where there is a high-level system there that is confined by one of these low permeability layers. And it very clearly shows, using, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, both isotopic data and carbon-14 age dating of the water. We find modern water on top, older water from higher elevations down deeper. So in terms of the chemistry, let me explain sort of the isotopic tracers that we're using. Water has sort of an internal tracer that we can use. We have two different isotopes of oxygen, one with an atomic weight of 16, one with an atomic weight of 18. We have hydrogen and deuterium. Okay, so we've got basically water that is isotopically light and isotopically heavy. The important aspect of that is that water vapor with the heavier isotopes tends to condense slightly more efficiently. And so as we have marine air moving ashore, the isotopically heavier form of the water is precipitated out first, and the terminology here is going to be foreign to most people, but seawater is defined as our standard. The isotopic composition of rainfall near the shoreline is depleted by 3 parts per thousand in the oxygen 18 relative to seawater. However, as those clouds move further and further upslope, the oxygen 18 is progressively more depleted. And so the work that's been done here on the island in the past, this was done by Martha Scholl and other researchers, they've actually gone out and, strange as it sounds, placed buckets from sea level up to the summit of Mauna Loa and collected 2 years worth of rainfall over that period and determined the isotopic composition of that rainfall. And so what we can see is near sea level, this is the elevation in meters here, this is the degree of depletion of the oxygen 18. We see rainfall, again, at near sea level, oxygen isotope ratio of about -2 to -4. As we go up higher in elevation, we get up to 1,000 meters, it's 4 to 5, 2,000 meters, it's in the region of 6 to 7, -6 to -7. So this gives us the ability to sample well water anywhere on the island and then look upslope and say, okay, where did this rainfall come from? And in fact, we see divergence in some of the isotopic compositions that tell us that not all of the water hitting the ground at high elevation is actually getting to this point downslope. So this is how we use this. And this is again a cartoon for heavier, isotopically heavier water falling as rainfall, becoming progressively lighter, and then in the sampling that we did, we sampled this water running along the top of a confining layer. We found it had a carbon-14 age of 0. The water down here deeper, and actually had an isotopic composition of about 3.6 to 3.8. And the water that we sampled in this deeper formation, it had an age of about 3,000 years, and it had an isotopic composition that indicated it came from an elevation of about 8,000 feet, 8 to 9,000 feet elevation. So we see basically this segregated, isotopically segregated water. Same is true of the work that we did on this aquifer here. When we sampled that water, we found that it had an age of about 2,000 years. And isotopically, it was derived dominantly from rainfall on Mauna Kea at about an elevation of 7,000 feet. We've sampled a number of the Department of Water Supply wells. This is a project that's currently ongoing, and the Department of Water Supply is sampling on a monthly basis to do other chemistry on the water, but they very kindly provided me with a subset of their samples so that I could analyze the isotopic composition of that water on an ongoing basis. And what I'm looking for is to see if that composition is uniform or if I see seasonal changes, and sort of really trying to understand how we can use these isotopic compositions. This is a plot of some of the data that we've accumulated from wells on Mauna Kea, and isotopic composition down here, the oxygen 18. And as expected, these wells are on Kilauea, where the rainfall is derived, can't be derived from an elevation greater than the summit of Kilauea. And so we're seeing average isotopic compositions of 3 to 4 to 5. The Holualoa well, we're seeing slightly higher hospital deep. This is Honaka'a, and we believe, is getting water from Kohala, so the elevation of that rainfall also is restricted to a low elevation. But we get out here to the Saddle Road A well. That well is located at a 2,000-foot elevation on the Saddle Road, just below Kaumana City, and isotopic composition is here in the -6 to -7 range. Likewise with the University well and the Pi'ihonua well. And again, those wells, this is the Saddle Deep, Pi'ihonua, and the University well, all located there. And that -6 to -7 puts us basically in this region here of Martha Scholl's plot of rainfall recharge. And so The dominant source of water in these nearshore wells is all from elevations much lower than the summit of Mauna Kea. So another more limited data set we have and we have to consider is how old that water is, and I've referred to this a couple of times. This water, about 2,000 years old. The PTA, that water is dike impounded. That water has a carbon-14 age of about 5,000 years. And the Waikiki well, which is a well located on the west flank of Mauna Kea, it's down slightly lower elevation, deep well there. The C14 age of that water is also about 5,000. And then the high-level aquifer at Keauhou, that water, again, is confined by the ash beds, and its age was about 3,000 years. So if water is taking that length of time, essentially the likelihood of contaminants surviving that trip is pretty close to zero. We have active, and we know this is occurring at all times in the groundwater system. We don't think about it much. Most people don't think about it much, I'm sure, but there is an active biological community within the geologic formation that even looks at diesel fuel and hydraulic oil as a food source and will break that material down. I'm currently working with DOH on the Red Hill fuel spill on Oahu, and that's one of the things that we're looking at. What is the rate of degradation of this fuel over time as contaminants move within the groundwater system? And of course, the other biological contaminants that would be in wastewater would likewise be subject to the same kind of a breakdown process. Then finally, I wanted to look at the other potential sources of contaminants that we know exist on the island. And we're looking at the wastewater systems here at the summit and Halepohaku. And then these are the wells that potentially are drawing water from recharge into Mauna Kea. This is a plot the Department of Health provided me with a database on what they call on-site disposal systems. These are cesspools and septic systems. And I've plotted here the cesspools and septic systems that are already present in the Hilo, Kaumana, and Hamakua system or region. And you can see within these communities, the number I haven't counted, but it's well in excess of 10,000. And then we can look at similar systems located here, sort of within the Honoka'a, Waimea, and Waikiki area. So, in fact, there are literally thousands of other sources of contamination that are located much, much closer to our drinking water wells than anything that we have in the upper elevations of Mauna Kea. So, given that large number of contaminants, even if, which I think is unlikely, a contaminant from, say, a summit septic system was able to migrate down into the nearshore environment, you would not see it from the existing sources. A take-home message: simple models are great for sort of giving a general idea of our groundwater system, but they really can only be relied on in uncomplicated geologic regions. When we consider groundwater flow, we have to consider the geologic structures, and this is something that I'm trying to sort of progressively develop the database so we can develop a better understanding of how groundwater is moving, because the geology does clearly affect the flow paths, and realistic assessment of potential for contamination, you have to take into account all the other sources and how those sort of will interact with whatever source you're examining. And with that, I'll be happy to answer questions.
So what's in the Pohakuloa shallow water well? Has it been analyzed?
The shallowest water, the perched aquifer, has not been analyzed. We were not able to sample that. We have sampled the deeper aquifer, the regional aquifer.
Why weren't you able to sample the first one?
Because,
700 feet.
because the formation was extremely unstable, and in order to sample water from a borehole like that, you have to pump water out because you're using water to do the drilling. And by doing that, you run the risk of collapsing the well in on your drill string and then losing the entire effort and losing the well. We did sample that deeper water. We analyzed it. I provided a list of the analytes, some 60 analytes that were run for that deeper water. And we had all non-detects. We were looking at pesticides, chemical contaminants, the entire suite of drinking water analytes that Department of Health requires. And we got non-detects on all of them. So, you know, if at some point in the future we are able to sample that shallower aquifer, I'm certainly going to do that, and we will certainly run an analysis of that water. And that, as I told you at my prior presentation, that data will be published at the completion of the project. Yes, ma'am.
In regards to some of the rock layers you're speaking about, some of those impermeable rock layers, when you folks were pile drilling, was there any measures taken to then seal those?
Well, at the completion of the Kemuku drilling project, we actually sealed the entire well. We backfilled it with concrete, and so that well is completely sealed. We have essentially injected concrete behind the casing in the PTA 2 hole. Our hope is that we'll be able to go back in and do some additional sampling and monitoring and use that as a monitor well to look at how water levels change with time in respect to rainfall recharge and other natural processes.